Liangyue is a very unique character. As a true limited, she came with the first deck manipulation mechanic in the game. Now, let's be real, in any live service games, characters kit eventually turn into ISAs, and Reverse 1999 is no exception. Just look at this wall of text. But despite how overwhelming it might seem at first, she's actually pretty straightforward to play. To make things easier to follow, I'll be using simplified terms for her kit, like gray marks or red field, instead of the in-game terms. Liangyue is a follow-up focused DPS that is relatively AP hungry, especially before P1. She has a very specific core mechanic, and it's all centered around her ultimate. If you can maintain her ultimate uptime, you can deal tons of single target and AOE damage very consistently with her. Liangyue's ultimate gives the team 1-turn immunity buff, summon her cat to slam the enemy for a tiny bit of damage, then give Liangyue a special buff that lasts for 3 turns. You actually only benefit from this buff for 2 turns, because the most important effect of it only takes place if the buff is on her at the start of the turn before you can pick your actions. If Liangyue starts her turn with her ult active, you'll see 2 colored fields appear over your hand. On the left hand side, there's the green field. Card played here will have the duration of any buff or debuff they apply extended by 1 turn. It doesn't work on anything labeled as special or channel, but it does work on things like Flutter Pages plus 1 AP, which is an absolutely cracked synergy. It even boosts ultimates, including her own, since they are also considered as incantations. So, if she casts her ult while in the green zone, then 1-turn immunity becomes 2-turn immunity instead. Then on the right side, there is the red field. Playing card here increase their incantation rank by 1. Not the fake rank up like the Mercurius, but a real one that directly buff the skill's effect. And when you start playing cards, this field will start overlapping. Using a skill in the overlapping zone will cause the card to benefit from both effects at the same time. Outside of the card enhancement mechanic, there is one more big mechanic tied to her ultimate. That is this AOE attack, which is related to this special card with claw mark on it. To activate it, you need to fill this card with 6 marks, and depending on what kind of mark you collect, you'll trigger one of the 3 different versions of the attack. You can collect 3 different types of marks: the red mark, the gray mark, and the mixed mark. For most part, this is pretty self-explanatory. You will get red mark when you use incantation from the red zone, gray mark when you use in the green zone, and mixed mark when you use it in the overlapping zone. Her own skill also generates marks. You will get a red mark when you use Liangyue skill 1 and green mark when you use skill 2. If you use Liangyue skill in the colored field, you will gain the mark from both sources, letting you charge it faster. Charging this up is a key part of Liangyue's gameplay, as the AoE coming from it being quite powerful. As I've previously mentioned, there are 3 versions of the AoE attack. Which one comes out depends on how many marks of each color you end up collecting. If you have more red marks, she'll use the red AoE. It deals 400% damage, counted as a rank 2 incantation, and gets bonus crit rate and crit damage for each red mark she has. If you instead got more green marks, she'll then launch the green AoE attack. This one applies stack of poison and burning to enemy based on number of green marks she has. The AoE itself also has 400% multiplier like the red AoE, and gains bonus damage from poison stack and bonus penetration from burning stacks. Now, mixed mark do contribute to the bonus effect. However, each mixed mark only count as half a red and half a green when calculating those bonuses. One interesting interaction here is that you can actually build free green mark with versatile cards. While these cards are not really considered incantations, as long as they are used within the field, they will still accumulate mark for Liangyue. This could be especially helpful in plays like the roguelike mode. Finally, there is a third version of the AoE that triggers when your marks are evenly split. This one deals noticeably less damage, but it does give Liangyue a special buff that lowers the number of marks required to activate the attack next time. There's more to how that version works, but honestly, it's not really worth diving into until P5. We'll come back to it when we break down her portrait, which, for better or worse, are a huge part of her kit. Now, before moving to her skills, let's look at one last thing that is coming from her ultimate, which is a defensive stacking buff for the entire team that stack up to 30 times. You get 6 stack of this buff right away when you use her ult. She will also grant a stack for each mark consumed by the AOE Follow Up. Technically, this buff only lasts for 2 turns, but every time Liangyue uses her skill 1, the duration gets extended by 1 turn. So if you keep using her skill 1 regularly, which you will be, this buff can stay active pretty much indefinitely. At max stacks, it gives your whole team a 24% damage reduction, which usually takes around 5 to 6 turns to fully ramp up. Outside of the buff extension effect, her skill 1 deals decent single target damage and benefits from bonus penetration at rank 2 and rank 3. Liangyue's skill 2 is as big of a damaging tool as her AOE Follow Up, or at least when it's used properly. When used, Liangyue's skill 2 apply a buff that lasts 1 turn. However, it's a lot easier to think this as 1 stack instead. They only made it a turn-based buff so it can benefit from her green field, which increase the buff to 2 stacks. And just like many other stacking buffs, the buff can be stacked from multiple use of her skill 2. This buff gives damage bonus and damage reduction to the target. But the most important part is what happens when it gets consumed. 1 stack will trigger when the character attacks, take a hit, or when the turn ends. And when that happens, Liangyue automatically follow up with the skill 1 of the same rank. So for example, if you use a rank 1 skill 2 in the overlapping zone, you will end up with 2 stacks, and both will trigger rank 2 follow up attack from Liangyue, each one dealing 300% damage and get 30% penetration. Most of the time, you want to give this to Liangyue herself, because she is the DPS of her team. And so far, there hasn't been a meta team that uses her as a support. It also is good if you could keep this active until the turn ends, so the AOE Kalau attack can benefit from the damage bonus. So, up to this point, she sounds pretty amazing, right? So why is everyone doom posting about her? Well, let's circle back to her ultimate and her rotations in general. The one thing you absolutely want to avoid when playing Liangyue is letting her ultimate fall off. If it expires, you lose all the marks you have left on the current card, and the next time you cast her ult, you'll also have to wait a full turn before the field show up again. To keep her rotation going at P0, you'll have to get used to doing empty card movements, literally moving her card just to generate Moxie, so you can recast her ultimate every other turn. This is not a very smooth or comfortable way to play, and it basically means you are giving up any free AP benefit you'd normally get from Flutter Page's +1 AP buff extension. Her P1 makes a huge difference on her rotation by extending the duration of her ult by 1 turn. So instead of having 2 turns to build up 5 Moxies, now you've got 3. That extra breathing room makes her rotation way more manageable. On top of that, it also changes her colored field. At P0, her field only covers 3 cards on each side, which leaves a 2-card gap in the middle. This means you won't see any overlapping effect until you've used at least 3 cards, and even then, only 1 card in the center can benefit from both the rank up and the duration extension. Her P1 expands the size of the field from 3 to 4, so after just 1 card to use, the overlap happens, and it covers a significantly bigger field overall. Despite only changing 2 numbers in her kit, this P1 is hands down the biggest quality of life portrait we've seen so far. While it is practically impossible to quantify the actual DPS contribution of her P1 since you can't really calculate the contribution of additional field size, it is definitely worth getting if you're able to. Comparatively, her P2 is not that big of a deal. This portrait allows her to start combat at max Moxie instead of 3, which allows her to ult immediately instead of 1 turn after. It also reduced the required mark to trigger the follow-up by 1, which is a decent damage boost overall by allowing more AOE follow-up to come out. Her P3 is a very reverie-coded portrait that doesn't contribute to DPS at all, upgrading her ultimate to grant 2 turns of immunity and 6 more stack of her defensive buff. With her green field amplifying the immunity buff, you will end up having 3-turn immunity buff applied every 3 turns, so take that how you want. And her P4 is just a direct boost to her skill 1's damage and allows her defensive buff to stack up to 40% damage reduction. Now, P5 is a really big one. Despite having a weaker foundation at P0, Liangyue's P5 make her as powerful as other true limited at P5. First off, this portrait already boosts her AOE follow-up to a pretty elevated state. But the biggest boost from this actually happens on the balanced AOE follow-up, which triggers when you have the same amount of red and green marks. This attack is significantly weaker than red and green attack at base, but will give Liangyue a special buff that reduces the mark needed for the next AOE attack by 1. If you trigger the red or blue mark after, you will consume the buff and slightly increase the multiplier of that AOE. However, if you continue to trigger the balance mark, the buff will instead stack, and the balance AOE will gain a significantly higher multiplier boost than the colored AOE. P2 reduced the base mark required down from 6 to 5, and P5 increased the max stacking of the buff from 2 to 3. It also increased its base and boosted multiplier, increasing its max multiplier potential from 320 to 600%, with the minimum mark required down to just 2 marks. If you use Liangyue's attack in the opposite field to trigger this, you will be able to unleash 1 AOE per skill, which is quite powerful. With that being said, even if you opt in for the regular playstyle, you will still enjoy a over 50% damage increase to her AOE follow-ups, which is not something you can dismiss. For Resonance, it's best to focus on crit and Incantation Might. Her red AOE attack has additional benefit of converting excessive crit rate to crit damage, and she's often paired with Flutter Page, who grants additional damage bonus based on the crit. For Psychube, you'll absolutely want to go with Signature Psychube if possible, which is very easy to stack with Liangyue as she does a lot of follow-ups. It will be in the event shop and should be your priority. If you absolutely do not want to upgrade her Psychube, you can use Jiu Niangzi's Signature Psychube instead as a secondary solution. For her team choices, you always want to pair her with Flutter Page if possible. The synergy with the +1 AP is just too good to pass on. Not to mention Flutter Page's insane buffing capability for follow-up attacks. And Fatutu is definitely the best healer for her. Not only are there synergy for the follow-up, Liangyue's Greenfield can also extend the duration of her ultimate's beacon debuff, further increasing her effectiveness. Euphoria Sotheby can also be used as the healer for her. It's by no means the most ideal playstyle, but for many, this is their last resort for that specific Reverie stage, with her healing capability also boosted with the green field. You want to focus on using the green AoE if you end up using Sotheby, as the green AoE will gain damage bonus for each stack of poison enemy has. For the last slot, I definitely recommend Mercuria if Liangyue is at least P1. Due to Liangyue's field effect, you will be using quite a bit more high-rank incantation than usual. Otherwise, you could opt into general support like Argus or have 37 in that slot. Since Flutterpage is also in the team, 37 will actually do decent amount of damage. And that's pretty much all you need to know about Liangyue. I know this guide is quite a bit longer, but at least for Liangyue, portrait is something I had to address in detail. And that's everything you need to know about Liangyue. She's a pretty complex unit, but once you get used to her rotation and manage that ultimate properly, she can pump out some great damage, especially with the red team and of course portrait investment. Are you guys planning to pull for her, skip her, or even go for one of her portraits? Also, what do you think about her P1 and how it affects her gameplay? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear you guys' opinions. And as always, this has been SteamBandX. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.